This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Worriers episode 35. My name's Andy and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hi, Jörg.
Thank you. And I got the order right, so no one is discombobulated.
Yeah, that's right.
This episode is entitled Does God Have Agenda? And we're going to try and talk a little bit about whether how we see God and whether God has agenda, and really that is going to end up being us talking about how we see God, and that is going to leak out into how we see ourselves and each other. So it gets really complicated, but we're going to do our best to talk about it. And I also know that the internet is full of people sort of hurting each other and hating each other over discussions about gender. So
the internet?
We're going to try not to say, certainly we're going to try not to say anything horrible, but we're bound to say things that are uncomfortable because we're probably ignorant about whatever areas. So we're sorry if we do that, listener, but we don't mean to hurt any feelings, and we're happy to be corrected. So let's start with our homework. So our homework for this week was, if you had to choose a name by which you address God, what would it be? And let's start with Leah.
Mine is very simple. It would be love. And it sounds very corny and cliched, but it is still one of the most powerful words in the world. And for me comes the closest that I can think of describing what this universal power that we struggle to name so much might actually be about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's also quite jovial, right? You're right, my love. You know, so that's kind of
my duck.
It has everything from huge depth and great drama to
greeting.
Yeah, just a greeting.
Yeah, I've been listening to various podcasts about Julian of Norwich and St. Therese, or Teresa, I think it's Teresa of Avila, or that might be a different one. But anyway, both of them talk a lot about God's nature as love in really exciting and amazing and deep ways. Which I can't possibly try and reproduce, and I haven't actually read the things they wrote, I've just listened to podcasts.
It's good enough.
Although we shouldn't criticise people who listen to podcasts, right? That would be...
Yeah. That's where we all get most of our knowledge from.
Yeah. Jörg, how about you? How would you address God?
Well, I just went the easy route and pick one of the biblical ones. And I would therefore just keep Elohim. And what I like about that, it's a plural. And it's also the name of God used in Genesis, where it says male and female, he created them. Mm-hmm. So in the image of God, i.e. in the image of Elohim, the plural for God, male and female, he created them. So far, so good. But this wouldn't be Justice Worriers without me immediately taking apart what I just said. Elohim is a male plural. If you had goddesses, then it would be Elohot. So, and of course, it's a perhaps a majestic plural, right? So, like kings would use, or Donald Trump. Although that's not a fair comparison. That's problem number one. It's a male plural. And problem number two is that the conjugated verb, he created, is exactly he created. So if you were to read it literally, you would say, in the beginning, God's, he created heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. So it kind of shows how in language, and I think we have that problem all the time, like it's very, very hard to get around gendered language. Mm-hmm. And we don't like describing God as it. We don't like describing God in the full plural, because then it sounds like too polytheistic, and we're being accused of not being properly monotheistic anyway by our Muslim brothers and others. So we want God to be a singular, and then we want God to be a living being. So then we have to pick from one or two genders, and then we're all back into trouble again. So that's my homework, teacher.
Our Muslim brothers and sisters, indeed.
Yes.
And others.
Indeed.
And those who of different genders. All right, me. So I'm in a place at the moment where I'm maybe not addressing the question when I ask myself something like this, given that I made up the homework question. Because the only thing that came to mind when I thought about what my name for God would be that I'm thinking of God at the moment as being like the Monty Python foot, which comes down and splats things without warning. Because the way I often see my life is I got away with today, but tomorrow might be the day God destroys everything. So the Monty Python foot, I think it's probably a male foot. I'm pretty sure it looks like a man's foot.
Carelessly stomping around, that would just fit the stereotype.
Its behaviour, certainly, yeah. So that characterises my relationship with God.
Where does that come from for you? Is it a justice thing that you think, well, I'm living so well, so if the world was just in any way, the foot needs to come down? Or is it just sort of a generalized fear? Like, what is that? Let's unpack that a bit. I don't think it's punishment for privilege that I'm expecting. I think it's just the more aware I am of my privilege, and the more aware I am of people around me who have a lot of privilege and then have cataclysmic events happen to them, the more I think I'm living on borrowed time. Right.
And if you didn't believe in God, you probably would have that feeling too, but it would be about fate or something, do you think?
Maybe not fate, but the randomness of the universe, yeah. Like I deliberately take the Old Testament way of talking about God, where God gets blamed for everything, good and bad.
Jeez, there's just no way you're ever going to be an atheist then. Your God just can't disappear.
I take that fully on board. Like, I feel like there's two ways of going. You either decide God does nothing, and therefore is not really responsible for anything, and there's no real point engaging with God, or I prefer when bad things happen, I just want to blame God. So we'll go with that.
That's a whole other episode, isn't it?
Yeah, sorry. So I'm just preemptively doing that thing when nothing bad has happened to me and my life's been utterly charmed.
Yeah, wow.
Well, that just heightens the anxiety, right? Like, when is it coming?
Yeah, it does.
Justify those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen ones. To justify those that died, they're the chosen whites.
Okay, so let's move on to our worries. So let's start with Leah again, if that's all right. Leah, what are your worries about this topic?
So I find the idea of talking about God in lots of different ways, and that includes lots of different versions of gender, really helpful, and we can come on to that a bit later. But there is something that concerns me, that I'm just jumping on the bandwagon of what society is currently preoccupied with. So it depresses me really, because it feels like the church should be leading these great cultural debates about about the place of women, about race, about equality, and it feels like quite the opposite, that it's society that seems to lead, and then the church is pulled kicking and screaming along behind. So I worry that I'm just so desperate for the church to be relevant and up to date that I push this thing more forward than I would do otherwise. But yeah, that's my worry really, because that's it.
So when you say the church ought to be leading this type of conversation, what is it about the church, or why do you think that should be or could be possible?
Well, as Christians, we are meant to have some kind of connection with the divine, and we are meant to be part of bringing God's kingdom more present on earth. So you would kind of wish that anything that was lovely and joyous and pure and life affirming was championed by the church, wouldn't you really?
And revelations of wisdom, yeah, like
revelations of wisdom, new things. Hey guys, we've been thinking this for ages, but actually we've been, God's told us, or we've been listening to God, or we've been led by the Spirit, and actually, what about this? But it doesn't. It goes, oh well, the world's all talking about how there are lots of different conceptions of gender, and the patriarchy is hopefully on its way out. So the church feels like it has to jump on along.
Some of it a bit. I think it's interesting, because in the ideal situation, I also think the church would bring the wisdom of the ages, right? Of when we move on in our thinking, we don't throw out everything from the past, but we keep the great things we've learned over centuries, and are careful in the way we move forward as well. And I feel like we seem to be massively emphasizing that end of we bring our wisdom is never to change in any way. Or to only be changed when we're dragged along,
and never to even recognise that the church has changed so many times in the past. Not to even recognise that we have this very narrow conception at the moment of what it means to be a Christian, which doesn't even bear a very good resemblance to the historical witness of the church through the ages. So it's a shame.
It's really odd when you think about why is it certain subjects the church finds easier? It was easier for at least some of the church to speak up about apartheid in South Africa, or about the injustice of communism, or even if you take Wilberforce and others, after long centuries of silence against slavery in some parts, and that's a mixed bag of a story, as we've uncovered in previous episodes. But on everything to do with sex and gender, the church seems to want to have one template that fits for all, that it finds it harder to see when that template runs into problems and injustices, when it doesn't work for all, when it leads to, even just on questions like divorce, right? With abuse in marriage and things like that. It, for some reason, that's the topic where the church has never been leading, has it? Maybe in the New Testament times, the sort of women prophesying until they were shut up, just 100 years into the story.
Is it because religion is normally used as the means of control, and that it's a brilliant way to control people, to tell them how their bodies and their sexuality
I don't know if that's my understanding of religion. I understand religion more as sort of a tragic partner of where society is in some sense. So this instrumentalized version of religion, I don't know, there's plenty of ways to control.
That's a romantic view of religion. I definitely see it as a means of control.
Yeah, I guess when the church is in power, right? When it becomes a political tool, then it can definitely be used like that. But when the church is oppressed and not in power, it still doesn't lead on these subjects.
Right.
It's still very much an expression of the local culture, or the... in Ethiopian Pentecostals, which is one thing I've studied, when they free themselves from the missionaries very early on, they say they did that because they couldn't be led by a woman. You think that's really emancipation through an anti-emancipatory argument. So it's
I just think, as Christians, there's one glaring message in the Bible to me. It's that we shouldn't we shouldn't trust that we know what God's up to at any given moment.
Mhm.
That's just like the message that's written on almost every page of the Bible.
Right.
And yet it seems the lesson that we have utterly failed to learn
Mm.
time after time after time. And we've used our version of what we think God's up to at that particular moment to be in charge and have power.
Yeah.
And it baffles me.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. Jörg, what are your worries?
My worries. This is the whole topic is really worrying to me because it's hard to do it justice and to talk about it, like you were saying in the intro, in ways that just reflect experience gender in ways that I can't experience it. I'm a cis heterosexual male, and that's the limit of my experience of this. So that's one worry. The other one is that I sometimes have the feeling that the gender discussions can be a catch-22, and that the more we talk about them, the more we tend to reaffirm gender stereotypes. That some of the ways in which we talk about gender fluidity haven't gotten rid of the stereotypical male, the stereotypical female. It's just that I don't fit those patterns, but the moment I say I don't fit those patterns, I'm actually reifying the pattern as the norm. And then it just becomes a sort of vicious self-feeding cycle. And then my worry is, are we now going to read that into God? Like, will our preoccupation with gender end through talking, like with God's gender end through talking more about it, or will it just get worse and worse because it becomes a culture war more and more and more? So it's like these kinds of debates that just don't get better the more you have them, and yet we need to have them somehow. It's hard.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have them, right? I mean,
No.
I know it's hard, but it's been so wrong for so long, and it's been so hurtful and so painful to so many women and so many people who didn't fit the macho male mold as well.
Right.
So hard as it is, we've got to do it, because there is a prize to be gained, which is a better understanding and a better opportunity to connect with this divine being somehow.
Yeah. Well, but how can we have those conversations? That's my question. How can we have those conversations in a way that frees us all up from having to explain our gender? How can we learn to read each other as humans? Like, we need to free ourselves from gender stereotypes, and that way we need to talk about them. But how can we have those conversations well that we're actually free from them?
Yeah, and I think once you start, like, one thing that we probably need to do, like to address any problem, you need to acknowledge it, right? And so once we start acknowledging quite how significant gender is in the way we think about people, it's every sentence that you use about someone tends to have a word in there that identifies them by gender. Why is that? That's not a coincidence. It's because of the current way that we classify people. The most strongest classification is that.
Yeah.
So we've got a long way to go. But realizing that even acknowledging that that's a thing, and maybe even saying that's a thing we want to resist, seems like a step you have to take if you're going to improve.
It just seems really, really odd to me, though. It just seems really odd that we sit in church week after week and we only ever talk about he. And however tricky it is to try and do it differently, and however many other issues it might point up in the other direction, it's just weird, because God is not categorizable in human terms. So then we need to be as expansive with our language as we absolutely possibly can be if we want to even attempt to get some idea of who God is.
And yet the moment you do that, it takes certain people out of the picture, because then they suddenly think about God's gender rather than the other thing you're actually praying. Like, that's the weird bit. Like, the habits are so deeply ingrained that the moment we try and break them, the conversation becomes about something else.
But that's why you have to try it, because some people will find that difficult and other people will find it incredibly liberating.
Yeah.
I've noticed actually. Sorry, go on now.
Yeah. And maybe the first time you do it, it's worse than the second time or the fifth time or the 10th time. And
that's true.
It's like first time somebody told you to address them as they, right?
Yeah.
It was really hard at first.
I've noticed a couple of podcasts I listen to, people tend to use the word God self to avoid saying himself.
Yeah.
And that's gone from quite jarring to me to being quite a comforting word, because it has a slightly different nuance for me than himself or herself. It almost somehow softens the personality of the person in a way I can't necessarily explain. But yeah, so anyway, I've become more comfortable with that word over repetition, so that's potentially encouraging.
Yeah. So
in terms of this very, like as you said, Leah, like every single time we talk about God, in at least in churches that I've been to, we say he. But my understanding is that's not particularly justifiable from the Bible. Am I right about that?
Well, he moves, but we haven't really done your worries yet, Andy.
Oh, sorry, I'm going.
Not that we have a script or anything, but
I wouldn't call it a script, Jörg. I'd call it some very vague notes. All right. Well, we'll come back to whether it's justifiable in the Bible. Yeah. So my worry actually goes back to the foot. Because like there's something obviously wrong with my relationship with God or my conception of God, right?
We don't know, maybe he is the foot.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think sometimes it might help me to think of God as mother. It might make my relationship with God more healthy, not because God is a human woman, but because the way I think about God might benefit from the stereotypes around that idea and from my own ideas about my own mother and stuff like that. So yeah, I wish that I could think of God as mother, and sometimes I kind of experiment with using that word, but really it doesn't really impact me. It's so far from where my brain is at that I can't particularly engage with it.
Yeah, it's strange. We've been taught all these father stereotypes. It's not even just the gender of God, right? Not the masculinity, but this idea that we're all looking for a father because mother's always there. This kind of sense of loss and direction and all of this kind of stuff that I don't know if I've certainly heard of this countless times. And therefore then father, also how we talk about the sermons on Father's Day and Mother's Day, they're so different, right? One is about loss and shame and need to forgive and everything, and Mother's Day is about caring and being thankful and everything. And yet, when it comes to God, we just walk with that pattern. That's.
Yeah, I did some prayers once in church where I addressed God as mother, and I very deliberately used kind of mother type aspects to talk about God, but they were deliberately about strength and protection. To try and resist that thing of, oh God, you're like a mother because you're all soft and you never go away and stuff like that.
Well, I recently said the grace like for food, and started with Mother God, and my wife was afterwards kind of like, that was odd, like, because the image that conjured up in her mind was like earth goddess and sort of nature spirituality. So it's also quite weird how we've mapped the universe in that way. That up in heaven lives God the Father, like we're still the ancients. That heaven is sort of the guy on top, horizon in the middle, long way away, and woman is the earth. And that was also the ancient idea of heavenly creative reproduction, right? So the horizon is preventing that union from meeting, and therefore the earth isn't renewing as it should or something. But those images are so deep, and how we were taught that that Mother God, that's like too esoteric, too spirit, like that's the sort of evangelical fear of getting too close to those kinds of things, and earth being about witches and
the corruption that women bring to the world.
All of that, from Eve onward, right? That whole story.
But it's almost like you need to bring that out into the light, though. If you never use the term, then you never start to think about it and start to question it. Whereas once you say it, you're like, okay, that is the way I think about, and you start to notice, like we were talking before about the Lord's Prayer, and then somebody said the Lady's Prayer, and the whole conception, you're tittering. Yeah. The whole conception of the phrase is utterly different. Yeah. I slightly off the point, but I remember a friend telling me about the way that words, there's a whole series of female words which, if you say them in the male, sound absolutely fine. When you say them in the female, they have largely to do with being a sex worker. So things like master, absolutely fine. Mistress, courtier, courtesan. There's I don't know, I can't remember them all, but there's a whole like list, and language is so powerful. It creates these sir, madam. All these words that they're in the male, they're strong and they're sensible and they're to do with governing and then suddenly, I just think we need to bring this out into the daylight by actually saying it, and then you can start to go, oh, actually that's very deep, and it's only unearthed by talking about it. If you never talk about it, then it's always there.
Yeah. So. That is very compelling. Right. Well, that's what we're doing, so it's good.
Yeah. So let's start by talking. I mean, like you could take the spirit, for example. Maybe if we just tried tentatively and started to talk about the spirit as her, even just bring one female figure into the. Why is the spirit he? I mean, you could argue that there's something lovely about talking about God the Father, and there are wonderful things about fatherhood, but the spirit, maybe spirits don't have genders. It's bonkers. Why is the spirit always he?
And now you do what they tell you, and now you do what they told you.
And isn't the spirit often feminine in the Bible?
It is, yeah. It's often seen in sort of feminine terms.
But not in the way we talk about it in evangelical circles, right? You're talking about the Hebrew or something.
I'm pretty sure I've heard Richard Rohr say, or someone like that, that it's the feminine forms are used with the spirit.
Yeah. I'm forgetting my Hebrew genders, but I think it is actually. I think so.
If so, that is classic. Classic, the church that I was brought up in, of saying that we're incredibly biblical, but then picking and choosing which bits of the Bible we.
Yeah. Sorry, we put you on the spot a bit there, Jörg, but you're saying
it is feminine in Hebrew. I was thinking of Greek, where it's actually neutron.
Right.
So that's not helpful. But and English doesn't even have that, right? And other than the way English uses it is only for things that don't live. In German, you can use the neutrum is used for living things. So das Kind, for example, the child, is neutrum, and then
would spirit be neutral in German?
It's male in German, I'm afraid. But Sophia, and that's the one that often comes to mind as well in the old world, is always female, wisdom.
Lady Wisdom.
Yeah, Lady Wisdom.
And it's by the way, as a point of interest, I do have one friend, or like very distant friend, who who likes to be referred to as it.
All right.
But I think that person is quite playful, and it may be quite a playful use. I'm not sure.
Well, I like that because it actually puts the focus on the fact that we are part of the world. We are not like this idea of subjecthood, free acting subjects. Anyway.
Sorry, I think I took us off, but anyway, that's...
No, it's actually quite interesting because if you look at gender and God in the Bible and pick it up from there, then actually the story would be that God was once decidedly male and became more and more gender neutral or gender fluid as time went on, in some ways, in some respects.
How is that?
Well, I mean, the old sort of Palestinian and Canaanite religion, the head of the pantheon was El, the word that Elohim comes from, also Allah, and he had a female goddess, or what do you say? Cortez is not the right word. What's the word?
The word I used before.
No, the person accompanying a king or something. That's the word in English. Can't think of it. So his
consort.
That's the
consort, right? Yeah.
So his consort was Asherah, and what I like about this idea is that actually, if God is gendered, you could take very gendered problems to God. You know, if you had fertility issues, conceiving, that was definitely an issue for Asherah, or also fertility on the ground. Whereas, I don't know, anger issues or warfare or something, you would go to El for. So, of course, that's, the ancient world's gender stereotypes, but you could actually take gendered problems to gendered gods.
Right. So where is this coming from? This is not in the Bible, right?
No, this is you can pick it up in the Bible if you know where to look for it, because that's the kind of world in which the stories of the Bible happen. But because the stories of the Bible get consolidated so much later, like 500, 600, 700, 800 years later, that then gets carefully relegated out. But there is actually, so Yahweh was one of the gods of the pantheon. So all the different people in the ancient world then picked their own god from the pantheon. So for the Israelites, Yahweh gradually accepted, and he was a Sinite god for thunder and lightning and those kinds of things. And he then gradually accepts, when he becomes Israel's nation god, all the functions of the proper high god. And it's at that point that Asherah gets forgotten by the wayside. There's one inscription where it says Yahweh in his Asherah, so that there was a double worship going on for some time. And you can also pick that up in the Bible and its anxieties of not worshipping Asherah.
I was going to say Asherah is a god that's mentioned, right?
Exactly, she's mentioned in the Bible, and also other gods of other people. Then Baal, for example, of the Philistines, is also mentioned. So then you get this purification, and in the context of that, God takes up everything in himself, keeps his male attributes to some extent, but also now becomes more and more abstract, and we're traveling more toward this monotheistic conception, and then his masculinity is no longer on the foreground, but it's of course in the background. So there's no more female god left in the end, and who do you take your earthly problems to? There's nobody
other this is than coming the god. From like you say, Babylonian, from sort of like ancient Babylonian bones and things.
Well, this is from what you can kind of know from archaeology and from textual studies and what we know sort of old Palestinian history of religions, but it's that like you can pick it up in the Old Testament that there's still this battle going on. You know, how many gods should Israel have? This is why the prophets are always judging them about it. And where you should worship your gods, and should you go to Jerusalem, or can you sacrifice to Yahweh on your local shrines? So those are all the kinds of fights that we have before everybody has to go to the Babylonian exile in 587 BC. And then, because of the story so the upper class in the exile writes about Israel, why they're here, what their fault was, what their wrong was, we then have this very monotheistic God emerging in the context of Babylon, also teaching the Babylonians a lesson, who then is very gender neutral to some respects, and is no longer, and is also described in bodily terms, but never in gendered bodily terms. There's no reference to God's beard or something, but we have his hands or his back.
So I just want to make a small space in the podcast for the listener. If listener is not familiar with this idea that Judaism grew out of these pantheon, how does one deal with that if one wants to, if one believes that God is and always has been this unified and sort of universal God? Like this is an idea that I imagine you've been familiar with for a long time. But if someone's hearing it for the first time, how do you cope with it?
Well, I mean, what I'm giving here is the answer of where sort of the history of religion and our understanding of theology is. And I found that quite disorienting when I first learned about it. But the archaeological evidence is also quite clear. So the way I deal with it is to say, well, maybe then what I need to recognize is that our understanding of God is always flawed, and we understand God with the concepts of our time. So if around us, I believe, and I'm taught to believe, that God does everything. He brings the rain, he brings the sunshine, he makes me victorious in battle, then of course that's what my depictions of God look like. And then actually even having figurines of God is not bad, because everybody has those. And then our understanding of God grows, and we have a different concept that he's perhaps bigger than that, and that these small gods that we're seeing around is actually idolatry. There's a lot going for monotheism and the idea of abstracting God. There's a lot in that thought, but there's also some bits that we lose. And maybe it's taking care of those, getting very abstract here, but it's taking care of those bits that we've lost and being aware of that, and that maybe God is male in our imagination, ever so slightly male, not very foreground male, because he once really was male. And we've forgotten the feminine attributes that we used to worship.
And we should remember as well that the early church spent a lot of time getting their head around what we now glibly talk about as the Trinity. And the whole kind of going from a very strict monotheism to, acknowledging that Jesus was God and that the Holy Spirit was God. So it's not like we haven't coped before with deciding that there are several different entities in God. And I suppose what I would be arguing for with gender is that we should think more about how there are several different genders in God. Now, there are limitations to all of our different conceptions of gender, and we could talk about that. But whatever they are, there's room for them in God. Is my view. And if we always only talk about God as he, living in a society with such a strong gendered stereotype of what he means, really limits our ability to conceive of what God might be like.
Yeah. I also think it might be helpful to look at this as part of the journey of the human race, right? So even if you restrict yourself to the Bible that we have, as opposed to putting it in that historical context that you've given us, Jörg, I still see the Bible as a growing understanding of what and who God is, that starts off with a lot of misconceptions and becomes more sophisticated, and I see that as the history of the human race since then as well, that we've gradually grown our understanding of God.
We've also lost bits along the way, and that's I think part of the point for me is like, if I live in a world where God has a wife, Asherah or a consort, where he does certain things and she does certain things, that's a very different idea of God. And then some of the sort of maybe sexual tension or the procreativity and the romance and the longing for one another are actually part of God. And that's something that we've managed to neutralize under this sort of soft father image. Single father of a single son with some female neutral spirit floating about. So we've lost some of the human experience in God.
So then we substitute that with the idea of the church as female, don't we? So then we have
right.
Jesus as
so
the
this
male, and then
this lone male takes on this pathetic female.
Well, but it's its son who marries the church, right? God still stays single. He's the single parent who thrones about it all, and God, Jesus is the bridegroom.
But Jesus is also God, so.
Yeah. And God himself was longing for Israel. I mean, there's plenty of really raunchy stuff in the Bible where God accuses Israel of being a sex worker, and like in the sort of really weird metaphorical language.
But isn't that an important change, though? That there was a way of thinking about God, that God was complete in God's self, because God had the male and the female, and together they made up a whole. And we are now talking about God in partnership with humans and in relationship with humans and longing for humans. So that's quite a different way of thinking about God, and the male and female still comes into that in the Jesus and the church, or as you say, God longing for humans.
But that's my point. We gain some, we lose some, right? I mean, because then you gain, what you lose, or the disadvantage of that is that jealous God. And that's where that language I just mentioned comes from. Like, then he's like, he feels betrayed by humans because they're not fulfilling his need for completeness, and that in itself is a right.
So that's actually really helped me, Leah, because I'd only really thought about that kind of marriage between Christ and the church as a negative thing. Basically, really hard for me to understand as a heterosexual man, and really putting humans in a subservience to God, which is obviously a weird understanding of marriage coming from me. Yeah, thanks a lot. Me, but
that's how your marriage works.
Yeah, that's exactly how my marriage works, and we all know this. Listener, you won't necessarily understand, but that is a joke. But yeah, what you just described, Leah, as an acknowledgement of God's partnership with humanity, and that's what that's talking about. It's like the first time I think I've ever thought of that idea in a positive way. So thank you.
Well, that's good, because I also have a really negative version of that as well.
Yeah, I mean,
just my overriding. Bring it on.
But maybe we'll come on to that later, because perhaps it's a bit off the point at the moment. But yeah, anyway.
Well, why not?
I have found recently this idea of God working in partnership with humans really, really helpful and instructive. But I do also worry that we are creating a sort of a feminized church where we appeal to the feelings of women who feel hurt and betrayed and badly treated by men, and we are setting up this kind of this God, this Jesus that will be the man for you that no other man has ever been, and will kind of will fulfill all sorts of needs that you have and satisfy you, and we'll sing endless worship songs about how much we love Jesus. And I just don't actually think that is a real promise, because it's very few women that actually find that kind of, and I think we're talking about Julian of Norwich and things, weren't we? I do believe in history there are women who have had that kind of intensity of relationship with Jesus, that it has been sufficient and enough for them. I'm not saying it never happens, but I think it's rare. And I think we're selling women a falsehood, and we're also creating a kind of church that feels a little bit alien to men. So that's also a problem with that Jesus and the church as the bride.
Yeah. And because it's read through biological sex. So the way men can access this is through the lost father, right?
Yeah.
So then you can have your relationship.
That never approved of you.
Exactly, the father never approved or whatever, and then Jesus can be your ersatz father. And but we don't have the mother language. Only the Catholic mystics saw Jesus as feminine to some extent, like in the sort of mystical wound in his side. And that enabled a different kind of relationship. But we don't have that. Like it's completely gendered. And our relationship to God is then gendered.
Yeah. And it's not just gendered, it's also based on these weird stereotypes of gender.
Yes.
Right, like the idea that the only type of kind of passionate love is the love of a woman for a man.
But if I were to sing to God or to Jesus as my wife or my female lover...
Oh, wow.
That would be really odd. That would seem so odd.
Yeah, but why? Right? You just said, and it's right, that as that's husband, kind of God can give you that, and I don't have a wife. You could then say, therefore, Jesus is going to be all that a wife could give me. And
my goodness, that sounds so weird.
But yet we say it about women and Jesus all the time.
Yeah. And again, that speaks of what our stereotypes are, right?
Yeah. And how what we've gained and what we've lost in that masculine God.
And it's also about how we've talked about this a lot, but I think it does still bear repeating, that we've personalized this whole gospel. The gospel is about you as an individual and your personal relationship with a personal Jesus and your personal experience, where you tell your story of where Jesus particularly kind of met with you in some emotional way. And that is true for some people, and some people have that kind of experience and it carries them through the whole of the rest of their life. But that is not everybody. I don't even think it's that common. And my life experience has been that I've discovered Jesus in ways that are intellectual and justice-based and inspiring, and I see this person that's described in the Gospels that I find utterly amazing. But it speaks to me as a person in the world, as opposed to speaking to me as me in my own heart, if that makes sense. Or both. It's both. It's not just the one.
And in that individualized thing, we've even run behind Israel or the early church, because what you pointed out, the positive thing about this gender tension was, like, here's a creative power that wants to really make something with humankind. If only they would enter a loving relationship with him, and then we could be complete. But that means all of us, not this sort of personal, sexualized, weird kind of relationship, or as that sexual relationship. And that's, I think, a better reading of the Bride of Christ would be as well, that it's not... It's about, making a new family happen in a union with God, not this individual. Jesus can be the husband I've never had.
Yeah.
I also think the other thing about this so-called feminization, or like stereotypically feminization of the church, is that I think we then miss... We're then potentially not encouraged to exhibit as a church stereotypically masculine virtues, like, for example, standing up against injustice. You mentioned justice, Leah. Like,
that's God's
that
job.
Would stereotypically be like a man type thing to do, And I do think the church is not as keen to do that as I feel like we should be, and stuff like that. Like they're kind of striking out. Like it's stereotypically male to like have new ideas and forge ahead with them, even though everyone else is lagging behind. So that thing we talked about right at the beginning of why isn't the church leading ideas, could also be made worse or caused by this weird stereotype of gender from that thing.
So
on the other hand, church was like a really male place for centuries, right? Like, and it was all about strong patriarchy, essentially. So maybe we need to make a bit of space for not having that before we throw it away.
Yep.
Perhaps, yeah.
I think that my concern is that we haven't really made space for it to be different. We've made space for women, but we've made space for women in a particular relationship to the male,
right?
And so those women are welcome, women are accepted, women are speaking, but they're speaking in a way that talks about this is how I define myself in relationship to this very male God. We haven't made God any less male. We've just made more space for women to talk about that male God.
Yeah. And we haven't talked collectively.
Yeah. And we haven't talked collectively, yeah.
And here's a radical thought. Is there a way to think of that, that union with God in a non-heterosexual way that puts gender stereotypes in? So you know how we said the interesting bit about that is that there is this longing of God to do something with the world. And we've read this in heterosexual terms, and then we discover that leaves us longing. And actually what we can learn from our homosexual brothers and sisters is that there's a different way to have this relationship that doesn't bring the same stereotypes in. Because if you're in a homosexual relationship, you have to actually figure out who's going to be like the mother or the father, or maybe you don't. Like you live outside of those tropes. But you still have that same longing of we belong together to be complete.
And the partnership, that's a really exciting idea that really does come through in the Bible, that God for whatever reason, I know Leah's particularly questioned the wisdom of this, wants to partner with us. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and I think that's why this area it's difficult, but it is exciting because you start to think about it and you play with things and you suddenly go, okay, let's that turns things on their head for me, and that's good, right?
Yeah, we've done that a couple of times tonight, like when Jörg suggested Christ as wife.
Yeah.
As wife.
That got me thinking.
Yeah. Maybe I need to read up on my mystics.
Some of those that work forces.
Yeah, and I think like when we discussed this before, we talked about the playfulness of that as a like, why are we so afraid of just trying out a different word?
Yeah.
And let's just call God they. I mean, the Trinity lends itself to that already, right? So let's just use it a little bit.
But God's is harder then.
Yeah.
Yeah, God's going to be controversial.
I mean, I now make a stroppy point of singing all worship songs as we rather than I.
Yes.
Because it annoys the life out of me that we go to church and we stand with all these other people and we say, I this, I that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, right.
Absolutely.
And often it works just as well in the rhyming.
Yeah.
Because we've built this culture around the worship leader that stands at the front and has written their pop song. And
leads us.
With
their own authenticity of the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's we and it's God as they. And the Lord's Prayer is our Father in heaven, not we. We wouldn't write that. We'd write my Father in heaven.
And I think that there's a tension there. I totally agree with you, but I think that I see people at the front of church saying "I" because they're resisting a kind of distancing that you might get by talking in sort of general terms and trying to be personal in the way they express themselves. And I appreciate that, but I do feel like it's...
And where's that distancing coming from? Why is it less authentic if it's you in community? Like, that's again our individualism, that you're only really you if you're only inside your own head. And then secondarily you have your relationship. Whereas we know we're defined by the relationships we have.
Yeah, and like that's the weird thing, that it is actually the truth that we are a collection, a body, not just as a church, but as a country or as a town,
or as a body of all the bacteria and the food and all the whole ecology that runs through a human body, the collection of cells that we call one human. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I like this. I like this playfulness because it allows me to come back to what you asked me earlier and say, what am I going to do with this God? So if I'm in a headspace where I realize I am nothing but a worm, I'm only ever going to see God in the images, in the language, in the ideas that are available to me, and I always know it's going to be so much bigger, then I'm not too far away from what Feuerbach called "we made God in our own image." I mean, Feuerbach, the philosopher, had a different idea behind that. He kind of wanted us to become whole by saying, you're really looking for love, you're projecting into God, look for it in yourself. That's not quite what I mean here. But like this idea, if I realize I'm always bound by the cultures of my time, then there's nothing... God may be eternal, but he's not available to me as such. He's not available to me in these attributes as if they're unchanging. The language keeps changing around them. So then I need to even, not just can, but need to be playful and try different ones and say, well, what does this image unlock? Where do I get when I address God as my mother, Jesus as my sister, or wife indeed?
Yeah, I think that it's helpful to me, because I would definitely have a tendency of thinking, oh, what have I done if I use different words for God or something. But it's really helpful that through this conversation and through stuff I've learned about some of the mystics, to know that it's a relatively modern idea that all the pronouns are he, and there was never any kind of mixing.
Right. And it unlocks different images in your head.
Permission.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. It's a bit of lag on the line. It just, like, when you experiment with it, you just get different sensations. Like, you address God differently as mother. There's a different reverence. There's a different sense.
Yeah.
And why would that be less authentic somehow?
Yeah.
Yeah, God is big enough to be represented by different proxy labels, right?
Certainly bigger than my little understanding of fatherhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
maybe this can be fun.
Yeah, I think it's just remembering that we don't have all the answers, and yeah, we are shaped by our society, aren't we?
Oh, so much. And that's like, maybe I can be happy about how I'm going to die because like there's no chance I'm going to escape most of those in my lifetime, but maybe I can have hope in some future thing.
The tears are running down my face almost that you are the one who brought up death in this podcast.
I thought you were going there with the little worm story, but
no, I wasn't even. That wasn't even in my mind. That was just what a worm knows of the world. But here we have Andy. There's healing in this world. Andy bringing up death in a podcast.
Yeah. Now I'm feeling a bit sad.
And I was just thinking, as you were saying, like I wanted to say, but we can go wrong and then we must correct and so on. But as we've unpacked in our conversation, is we always, every time we go a little bit right, we also go a little bit wrong. When we lost Asherah, we gained something very powerful, but we also went a little bit wrong. So there is no perfect language either. So all the more it stands, we must play with the language. We must try different imagery in the full understanding that none of the images whether father, whether mother, unlocks God purely.
Yeah. That is a freeing thought.
And that comes back to a point that Keith made a very long time ago, many podcasts ago, about forgiving and being patient with our other selves and our previous selves, and also with other people, because it's so easy to go, oh yes, well, I've had this great revelation about gender, and I now call God she, and you people haven't really ever woken up to this, and it's so easy to make this all part of our tribalism, isn't it? But it's just hey, maybe this might work. Maybe this is a way. Maybe this brings us something new. And then respecting the people who say, well, actually, we lose something when you do that. But because none of us have found the perfect expression, the perfect description, and that can make us loving towards the people who are in a different space with this. And
that's really good. I think it's so obvious that when we talk about a God who's not understandable, that we're not going to get to an understanding. But I needed to be told that, right? Because I'm still in this headspace of, I need to improve, I need to take one more step up the mountain to get to a better understanding. But it's very freeing to say, maybe I just want to play with a different understanding, and I accept that there'll be a loss and a gain to that.
Yeah.
And of course, it needs to be faithful to the biblical witness, but the biblical witness is much more plural, as we've discovered, in what it allows us to say. And even Jesus was he uses the image of a hen, of gathering his chicks under his wings. God has that too. There's some feminine language around God as well. We have the story of the church, Julian of Norwich playing with figures of motherhood. So this isn't us completely radically saying, what if God was for evil or something? This is not...
Yeah, well, I think that comes back to my initial worry that, isn't it fun? We can come up with all these crazy conceptions of God and they're all right. It's well, no, yeah.
Right.
That's where it's worrying that we just go, oh, let's just follow the crowd. And But I don't think you are, because you've just outlined, just off the top of your head, some very good reasons why it's faithful to the Bible and faithful to the church witness. So
just to admit some of our limitedness.
Indeed.
Lovely, thank you very much. So Leah, you have a reading for us. Are you happy to do that now?
I am indeed. So
what are we calling the reading?
Well, that's the thing. I'm struggling with the language because I can't get rid of kingdom. I can't think of a better word for that. Principality, maybe. Let's try
Dominion?
that. Okay, so I'm going to read this without a title because you'll know very quickly where it comes from. Our Mother in heaven, hallowed be her name. Her principality come. Her will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are hers, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Wow, thank you, Leah. So, I understand that prayer mostly to be about forgiveness, by the way. So, listener, I hope if we've hurt your feelings, you'll forgive us and help us to learn. This and all of our podcasts are a song of love to you, listener, and to each other. And we hope that that's how it comes across. So, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to Justice Worriers. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Worriers, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
And now you do what they told you. Now you're under control. Now you do what they told you. Now you're under control. Now you're under control. Now you're under control. Killing in the name of. Killing in the name of. Killing in the name of. You kill.